Last lecture in the series is on positive feedback, and we're going to contrast it to negative feedback, importantly. So, briefly, I already told you positive feedback is different than negative feedback. Positive feedback is, the goal is to carry out some sort of change and not necessarily to maintain homeostasis directly. I actually want to start off with a learning check question. So I want you to pause the video and answer this question, which is, in the body, what type of functions do positive feedback loops perform? All right, so the answer was A. They operate when a potentially dangerous or stressful process must be completed quickly before homeostasis can be restored. So they are involved in completing processes, opposed to all the other options here are more related to negative feedback. Primary mechanism for homeostatic regulation, that's negative feedback. Long-term control over the body's internal conditions, that's negative feedback. So the similarity between positive and negative is that they're both feedback loops, meaning a stimulus is going to cause a response. That response is going to change the stimulus. But the difference is here we're carrying out a process. So the reason to introduce it here is it's useful to contrast to negative feedback. The focus over the majority of the semester will be negative feedback. Positive feedback is more rare. So positive feedback itself does not maintain homeostasis directly. It's still necessary for organisms to function, though. So it's a nice example of not everything's about homeostasis. We need to do things sometimes, too. So in a positive feedback loop, the main difference is that the response reinforces or amplifies the stimulus instead of removing it. Remember, negative feedback, the big thing was that response, the shivering of your body, acts to counteract the stimulus and therefore turn off that loop. Positive feedback is the opposite. It's going to send that variable farther away from the normal value. So if body temperature were a positive feedback loop, when we started sweating, as our body temperatures decreased, that decrease in temperature would actually cause more sweating. So right, we keep sweating and sweating despite body temperature decreasing. That wouldn't be very helpful, because probably for sweating, you're exercising and you lose extra volume. That's just not how that's meant to be, right? It's not helpful in that situation, but that's an example of how the opposite direction. So in positive feedback, it's a cycle, positive feedback of never ending until something else changes, ever increasing response that sends the system out of control temporarily. It then requires some sort of intervention or change to stop. Let's think of some examples of positive feedback things. One would be childbirth. I'm going to go ahead and bring this picture up. I'll talk through it in a moment. Childbirth is a process that needs to happen as quickly as possible. And it doesn't stop until the baby's born. Other examples are blood clotting, milk letdown after childbirth occurs, and whenever the baby's hungry, inflammatory responses, and also the action potential of a neuron, that rapid action potential. There's other examples as well, so production of other things during digestion, for example. So one classic example shown here is the hormonal control of uterine contractions during childbirth. So how this starts here is the baby is growing larger, and processes happen to allow the baby's head to drop down into the lower pelvic region and push on the cervix. So the baby drops in the uterus, that stretches the cervix. The cervical stretch, there are receptors there, sensors that detect that stretch. They're actually mechanoreceptors. They detect stretch and is actually going to send that signal, not shown here, a nervous signal to the brain. The brain actually releases oxytocin. It's the pituitary gland, actually hypothalamus that then goes out the pituitary. Oxytocin is a neuropeptide that is a neurohormone. That's what it's a hormone that is a neuropeptide. And that oxytocin causes uterine contractions. So the uterus is contracting. What does that contraction do? Those contractions are pushing the baby down. They're designed to allow the baby to come out, help the baby come out. So when the uterus is contracting, that's going to push the baby against the cervix even more. So that's going to cause more cervical stretch. This is a positive feedback loop. It's going to keep happening. More oxytocin means more pushing, more stretch. More oxytocin, more pushing, more stretch. Round and round and round again, positive feedback, out of control system until the baby is delivered. Once that baby comes out, the stimulus just stops, right? There's no more cervical stretch. So that's the turning off of the system. In this case, something needs to change. The delivery of the baby turns off the cervical stretch. So now we have no more uterine contractions besides the placenta needs to come out too. That's one example. Another classic example is blood clotting. So this acts to maintain homeostasis indirectly, right? So we had to stop the bleeding in order to maintain blood volume, but blood clotting itself is not regulated by negative feedback, right? The idea is we're stopping the bleeding in order to maintain blood volume. Blood volume is the homeostatically maintained variable, not blood clotting. So we're indirectly maintaining blood pressure. So here we've got a break in the blood vessel wall that's going to initiate this feedback loop. We've got these platelet cells that are going to come and bind to that site of damage, and they're going to start releasing chemicals that attract more platelets. Why? We want help, right? There's bleeding going on. We've got to stop that bleeding. They're calling in more cells to come and adhere. That's a clot, a blood clot. So round and round and round it goes, platelets calling more platelets, calling more platelets. That stops when the plug has formed. That plug forms, that signal to the body that, okay, we're good, stop sending out that chemical so that we can stop asking more platelets to come. So obviously important for homeostasis, right? Stop bleeding, but it's not negative feedback because we're indirectly maintaining homeostasis. This itself is not maintaining blood pressure directly. It's just keeping you from bleeding. Let's have a couple learning checks here. So pause the video to answer each of these. 1, blood temperature is too low. This is sensed by specialized neurons in the hypothalamus of the brain, which send signals to the blood vessels of the skin so blood vessels can constrict. This then diverts the heat to the core of the body and less heat radiates from the extremities. Pause the video to ask if this is positive, negative, not a feedback loop, and what causes this to turn off. Okay, this is a negative feedback loop. We have temperature becoming too low and causing body temperature to increase by constricting blood vessels, and that diverts heat to the core of the body, and so you're losing less heat. So we're opposing that low temperature, turning off that stimulus, turning off the system. Ideally, if you don't get warm, of course, it's going to stay on. That's a key point. If you stay out in the cold and your body is doing this and your body starts shivering and your body's doing everything it can, this is going to stay on this feedback loop until, if you're still cold, right? But the idea is the response is acting. It's trying to oppose the stimulus. It's trying to turn the loop off. Whether it can do it depends on what the heck you're doing to your body. So what causes this feedback loop to turn off? An increase in body temperature back to the normal range. As long as that happens, this loop will turn off. Again, if that doesn't happen, if you stay out in the freezing cold, this is going to stay on to keep you alive. In this case, you also could draw out the components of the feedback loop. So you've got your stimulus is body temperature. You've got your sensor, specialized neurons. The neurons in this case actually are also the input signal. So these neurons are actually in the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus is also the control integrator center. So in this case, it's you always have a little bit of variation. You still have a sensor though, you still got a control center. The hypothalamus decides, sends a signal to the blood vessels, that's your output signal, that is going to cause the blood vessels to do something. The blood vessels are the target or effector that then carry out the response. Those blood vessels are going to constrict. That's the response. And that's going to cause body temperature to increase. All right, second one. In the stomach, the presence of a partially digested protein triggers the secretion of HCl, hydrochloric acid, and pepsin. Pepsin is an enzyme that digests protein. Pepsin digests proteins, causing more HCl and pepsin to be released. What type of feedback is this, and what causes it to turn off? This is positive feedback. This is where we need to have a process occur, a digestive process. We have the presence of protein triggering pepsin and HCl, which triggers more protein, which triggers more HCl and pepsin until digestion. Absence of the protein because it's actually broken down into amino acids and then moved into the small intestine is going to turn this off. So example of positive feedback. Just to kind of put these two side by side one last time, I kind of like this way of looking at it. Both positive and negative feedback are talking about a stimulus response relationship. Our bodies are responding to some stimulus, whether that be a change in temperature, change in glucose levels, presence of a baby, suckling of a baby on your nipple, damage to a blood vessel. Those are all stimuli. For negative feedback, that response is going to result in opposing the stimulus to turn off the system. So this is like the simplest diagram you could draw of negative feedback. Not super accurate, we don't have other components in there. But the idea is just to contrast the two here. Positive feedback, on the other hand, that response is acting to amplify the stimulus. So we've got a positive here. This one is going to maintain homeostasis directly, bring those fluctuations back toward the set point. This is going to take us out of control, but do something helpful, hopefully. Both important for functioning. This one is the one that's directly related to homeostatic regulation. So what we've done here is explain the components involved in positive feedback that act to complete a process and provide an example of positive feedback in the body. Two terms here that are specific to positive feedback. And then contrast negative and positive feedback systems in terms of the relationship between stimulus and response. That's that picture, that diagram I just drew, but the idea is understanding the big differences between the two in terms of completing a process versus maintaining homeostasis. That's all for now.